Good morning, everybody. Hello, howdy, how goes it? Today we're going to talk about an important topic, and that is death, burial, and everything in between. This is sort of uplifting conversation you want on a Sunday morning. But as we've been talking over the past year or so, really, among us as staff and among conversations with others, it's become really clear to us pastorally that there is interest and there is energy around talking about funerals, talking about mortality. There's been a lot of great books about that in the secular world, and also talking about what is the reason we do all of this stuff in church. So this week and next week, Pastor Ann and I will be kind of walking together through a little bit of what is a funeral about, what is it for, why do we do it, how does it work, those sort of questions. And then next week, talk a little bit more about the pragmatic pieces, the logistics, and we'll give you an opportunity to get some work done for yourself or for others when it comes to thinking about what you would like your funeral to be like. Maybe you've already done some of that work. Sometimes if you do that work with a funeral home, they might have a different angle towards some of what details they need as opposed to what we need. And so we'll reserve a lot of our time next week for some of those pragmatic, practical questions. Today is a little bit more of the introduction and a little bit more of the theory and the theology of what is a funeral for, really. There's a little caveat to start, is that there is no one right or perfect funeral. And one of my life experiences of this, as a pastor, I tend to be fairly liturgically orthodox. You might say I'm medium-high church on a scale from high church smells and bells to low church, pastor just wears jeans and there's a little liturgy, there's not a lot of structure and rhythm. I find myself medium-high. And so the order of things is really important for me. And in my own life, one of the things that came to bear was, in my mind, the funeral, theologically, should precede or come before the burial. Well, that wasn't what my grandma necessarily had in mind. My grandma had met with the funeral home before she died, with my grandfather too. They had set forth their plans. They paid their funeral in full. They had their gravestone up with even our names on the back because they loved their grandsons. There was only 2 of us, so we got spoiled. But what's fascinating is my grandmother had it set in her mind and in her heart and in her bones that her funeral would not go funeral, burial. She wanted private family burial first, and then a service at the church on the same morning. Now, this made theologian Matt cringe a little bit. Can you guess why my grandma chose to do that?
So you can go to lunch right away.
Honest to God, she cared so much about hospitality, she didn't want any of the friends or family who came to her funeral to have to wait for lunch. And so her value of hospitality, totally against whatever theological orthodoxy there might be, trumped that. And that was totally cool with me. And we did the same thing for my grandpa's funeral. In fact, at their home church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, there are more burials before the service now than ever before. I think they started a trend, or at least I like to think so. But it's a good reminder that there is no right or wrong funeral or service. And so as we talk, if someone describes their ideal funeral and you're like, I would rather die without a funeral than have it like that. We ask that you be good and follow the 8th commandment and interpret in the best possible light, and to really be sensitive to one another. This is, I mean, they're talking about death and funerals are deeply personal as much as they are deeply theological. And so there's no perfect balance of any of them. And so as we talk about that over these next 2 weeks, I think it's just a helpful reminder of doing that. So I'm gonna ask you to find a reasonably friendly looking stranger in your area. Someone maybe who you're not related to. And I want you to have a brief conversation with them for about 3 minutes and share an experience that you had of a funeral experience that you attended that was meaningful. Why was it meaningful? What was meaningful about it? And then on the flip side, you can also share a funeral experience that you had that was troublesome. Why was it challenging? Why was it frustrating or left you wanting something more? Does that make sense? So find a partner, again, preferably to whom you're not related, and because you can be in triples. We're being loosey-goosey about it, but to figure out meaningful or troublesome or both. So take 5 or 6 minutes and we'll do that.
Fill in the blanks. And I find it interesting that mean, it's not going out of course. I guess what I'm saying is right. Yeah, I went to Mount Olive, and at that time, St. Sebastian's College, I had to go back to
At times I hear, I know that. At the same time, I don't know that you're not my family or whatever, being unreal, I'm not there.
I always wondered about these some of the just like you do all these things.
Yeah, I have my plot.
That commercialized care, is that the way to get your business?
One minute warning!
Oh, I put that person. Is there a way
How they came up with
If you have spare time.
it's not a question of one night, it's just a question of what's in your I used to think cremation, that's this is
Well, I hope I get on.
honestly has all kinds of problems.
No, I don't have this one. I want to go.
It's sort of totally works out. This one is just not yeah, an imperfect body and a perfect body. I was getting enjoying this as well.
It sounds like you had some things to
I
talk
looked at my
about.
funeral.
If you'll come back together here, we'll do a little bit of a recap. Just of, yes, if you could write, that'd be awesome. What things did you notice, or what things made a funeral memorable or meaningful in positive ways? Think about characteristics or things. Just throw out some answers, and we'll write them down.
Music.
Music.
Can you be more specific?
Hymns.
Was that positive or troublesome? Positive. So just having any type of music was a good, what am I trying to say?
Popular versus religious.
Oh, so like it wasn't just popular secular music, it was hymns.
Amazing grace. That's what you're gonna have.
We went to a funeral in which the husband died, my friend. Her son got up and talked to the minister during the service. And he said, the minister said, I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that.
It was a disruption, if somebody comes and somehow dislocates, there should be a feeling of reverence is what we were looking for.
Right.
So you've been to a funeral without that sense of
feeling, yes.
reverence.
Oh, yeah.
So somebody kind of took the pastor aside in the middle of the funeral and wanted to
And
change
allowed
something.
sin.
But it was, I think what we were missing was the fact that it didn't have a feeling of solemnity, is there such a word? Is there such
I'm
a word?
taking
You
over
would
your
know.
desk.
No, I don't care. We can I'm not really wed to this. But weddings are in 3 weeks. No, just kidding.
Yes, I always was uncomfortable with cremation until I attended a funeral of Joanne's cousin, and the priest said, we trade an imperfect body for a perfect body, and like, that could be okay.
Ah. So you might be, either
So
way,
it was
depending
uplifting, it
on.
was kind of a comforting, like, okay, that isn't such a problem.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about cremation next week too. So that could be good or bad or otherwise. Diane and then Dee.
A feeling of celebration.
Celebration.
A lot.
That's good.
That was good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
See, I don't like that.
All right, Dee.
I was at a funeral where there was no religion, so there
Yeah.
were no words of hope or comfort or
Always that same
we'll
way.
see you again, or it was horrible.
Other things that made for a positive or a negative. Linda, then Don.
Well, the worst funeral I ever went to was my grandma's, and it was a gravesite. We don't have a big family, but the pastor never referred to her by name once. He just called her our dear departed one. Not once. It was Missouri Synod, old school Missouri Synod, and you're not supposed to say anything, I guess, good about the person. Not supposed to, you know, so, not personal.
Generic.
Or bad.
Impersonal.
Impersonal.
Generic or-
Personal, yeah.
Yeah. No name.
No
I
name.
called you by name. You are mine. Like that's
Yeah.
theologically there. Yeah, Don.
I thought it.
I think everybody here will agree, at Sue Erickson's funeral, the most touching thing that I have ever heard was a recording of her singing. She had a beautiful voice, and they played a recording of her singing at her funeral. I had never had that happen before. It never. I was so touched, I couldn't even speak. It was one of the most beautiful things, and I don't know how other people here feel about that, because everybody here, I'm sure, was there. And it was one of the most beautiful things
I
I've
wasn't.
ever heard. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard.
Yeah. So having a way to make it personal.
Yes.
Right.
2 weeks ago, I went to a funeral that had no religious context also, and had 2 songs, The Lion Sleeps Tonight, and Sunrise, Sunset. They were the 2 songs that were sung at the funeral, and I didn't see much sense to them.
So maybe that was, what's interesting about this is that perhaps that was very personal. Perhaps that was
That was
that
one of his favorite
person's
songs, The
favorite
Lion
song.
Sleeps Tonight.
But that may be something that is very, like, so personal like that, at some point,
Becomes religious?
well, it cuts out, what am I trying to say, like a more general experience for other people.
It's so personal that it becomes exclusionary to those who weren't in on the personal touch to it.
That was sort of conducted by a Catholic deacon, I think it's called.
Yeah.
But never did he mention, like, you know, anything religious at all was mentioned. Only people came up and got up and mentioned how nice a person he was, and he was. So,
Brian and then Joanne and Carl.
To the exclusionary comment, in my life I've experienced funerals that are open casket and closed casket, and quite often open casket is thought of this is a great way for closure for family members, people who've not seen the person in a while or whatnot. Sometimes open casket can be very troubling.
yeah.
Will you instruct people up in the front have bad ears? And
I
Can you
will.
say that? Okay, here.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I repeat what you said?
Sure.
Rick? That open casket versus closed casket could be comforting or not disturbing, depending on the. And when I was in high school, one of the kids in our high school was killed in an accident, where he had been drinking and partying, and the parents specifically chose an open casket to scare the other high school kids straight. Now, again, that's a weird motive, and was part of our own little moralism in rural woebegone. But you know that there are ways that open casket, closed casket are used not just for the people or the family, but in other ways too. That's a excuse me. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week too. Joanne, and then Carl, and then Fred.
This is probably kind of like that, not personal, but it may also just have been the pastor, but they didn't say anything about the person. They used it as a time to moralize and just give a hell and fire and brimstone sermon. It was awful.
I've been to one of those.
Not anything
To shame those members of the family that came from a different religious tradition.
Whatever.
Or, we know Jane is going to heaven, but do you think you are going to heaven today? That's happened at ELCA funerals, I've been to. Yeah, I think that's what you were saying, Joanne. I didn't mean to steal your thunder there. Carl.
Tears. I grew up in a very stoic Lutheran faith. To how you get permission for sadness and for vulnerability when people gather. I don't think Lutherans have been doing that too well lately.
So, a space for emotion.
Yeah. Tears, sadness, grief.
Tears, yeah.
So that's okay with you? That's a
It's
it's a
becoming
good
much
thing.
more. I get much more permission for that in myself and others.
And that can be hard, yeah. Arlene, and then Darla, and then Nancy.
Okay, this happened at my sister's funeral. She was not familiar with the minister that the funeral home had gotten. And when they met with my niece and myself, he came in and he said to us, I hope you both don't have too much to say because I have another appointment to go to.
Cut his pay by 50%.
Basic compassion for the grieving. Oh, I'm sorry that happened,
And then
Arlene.
there's another one. I went to my cousin's funeral. It was at a Catholic church. And the priest stood up there, and while he was talking about my cousin, he stopped and he asked his wife what her name was. I forgot the name.
Well, it sounds like we have enough to compile a bunch of horror stories here. My goodness. Darla, you had one.
Yeah, I've got two things. One on the positive side, and I like this in the Catholic tradition, and I did this for my father when he passed away, having communion at funerals. I really appreciate having that.
I'm all with you.
And secondarily, for the train wreck, letting people come up. Does anybody have anything to say about the deceased?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God. I have seen things go off the rails really quickly.
So open forum speaking
No.
is not, doesn't seem, maybe it's cool for some folks, but that was one of the, Nancy, and then Chris. Chris, did you have your hand up? Yes, okay.
Well, two of the best, I mean, Sue's funeral was good, but two of the other best ones that I've ever been to were Norma's funeral.
Yes.
Norma Winters?
Yeah. They had all these Christmas trees up in the front because she liked Christmas, and they had all ornaments that she painted and decorated, and it was personal, but it was, I thought, inclusive too. And Ed walked down the aisle with her tap shoes, and it was. And then Larry Jenbeck's funeral. That man was so beloved by his family. It was like, I couldn't imagine anybody saying anything nearly that nice about me. Wow. Gee, nothing can compare to this guy.
Chris.
When my ex-husband passed away, it was at a Catholic church, and the whole communion thing was really just very difficult because they would not allow my daughters or anybody else to take communion, although they allowed them to bring the sacraments down the aisle, which I never truly understood because the same thing was done at their grandmother's funeral.
You can set the table, but you can't
You
eat.
can't do something. And so that was horrible.
Yeah.
Because there was so much tension at this funeral anyways, for my children especially, it was terrible.
It adds insult to already the grief of what's happening. Isn't it interesting how so many of the things we put up on the board are both ands? That to some degree it can be really, like communion at a funeral, I love it. But communion at a funeral can go all awry at all of those pieces. Anyone else who hasn't said anything yet? Sorry, Petey, and then we're going to keep going because we have lots to cover.
Yeah.
At Helen Kinsey's funeral, I know there is someone Jewish in her family. I think it's a daughter-in-law.
Right.
And they had someone sing the traditional Jewish, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. And can't it?
They canted it.
And it was so beautiful and such a way of uniting the traditions and of saying goodbye.
Yeah. We'll get into this a little bit next week too. The Kinsey family chose to be involved to the point where, and David talked about this a few years ago at Adult Ed, so I'm not just talking out of school, but they chose to accompany Helen to the crematorium, and they had a prayer there with her body, and then their family together pushed the button. Which they saw as deeply meaningful and spiritual and following and caring for her to the very end. But for other families, that might be horribly traumatic or just too visceral or too, that again, so it's one of these both ands on the continuum. Like, I thought it was really cool, but I was talking to my brother about it, and he was like, that's kind of weird. That personal preference and your own sense of spirituality and your own, sense of, and part of that was Helen's daughter-in-law is a pastor and had connections and have done that in her ministry, and so that felt for them, in one way or another, comforting, where you don't have, again, this is where there's no right or wrong, right? It's really up to you. So part of the reason we wanted to do this was to notice that we all have experience with funerals, be they for our family or a spouse or a friend, or the people we love here at church. And so the next place we want to go is talk a little bit, what is the purpose of a funeral? There's no one purpose, sadly. There's lots of purposes. And for me, the main purpose of the funeral is commendation, to commend the person who has died to God. Almost as if it's a remembrance of their life, and it's kind of a handing over. We've followed this person to and through death. Now, God, you've got the rest. So that's part of why we have a funeral. Another reason that we have a funeral is to console the grieving. It's part of the very beginning of the funeral liturgy. A lot of the prayers are focused on that part. And so there's a sense in which that's important. Sometimes the funeral is to show reverence, as we talked about, for the body as well as for the person's life. Early church burial practice was that the community would follow and lead a procession of the body to the burial site. So that procession of funeral cars and the funeral coach isn't just something we do because they wanted to use the hearse for more things than just transporting bodies. But there is a sense in which that was a liturgical part of early Christian life, saying that God has the power to bring these dry bones back to life. And then part of the funeral text is also to narrate the person's life story together with God's story. So that I see my task as a funeral preacher to weave God's story in together with the life of the person. My troublesome piece is when no one talks about the hardships of a person's life at their funeral. Because God redeems the crap too. And so it's good to be positive, but I often ask a family as we're preparing for the funeral, what was hard or challenging? What was a struggle in the life of the person who died? And that's the part that I think sometimes, that's my soapbox there for a minute. But for me, proclaiming God's resurrection and restoration isn't just for the good. The eulogy literally means good words. Those are important too. But there is a sense in which it can be a place of honesty about a person's life. I did a funeral. It was a one-off for the funeral home, and the person had been abusive as a parent. And none of the family wanted that mentioned at the funeral and respected that. But I felt like afterwards, I'm like, man, I feel like I missed a pastoral opportunity. And because I didn't know the family, it was hard. But it was hard to find good words to say. And so how does one go about it in that sense too? Pastor Andy, do you have other things? We talked the other day and you had some ideas of your own about why a funeral, what the purpose was.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
probably brilliant. What did I say?
I don't remember. It was different than mine.
No, I just, I know that one of the things that I said you've already mentioned, which is like the care for the actual body of a person. And in the Jewish tradition, there's a committee at the temple of people, it's usually women, but it doesn't have to be, who will wash the body of the dead person.
Still? Today?
Yes, who will prepare it for burial. You know, and which hits home for me because I used to wash the bodies of my kids, right? Like, who can't do that for themselves. And here's this loved person who can't do that for themselves. And you wash them, and it's like this last loving act that you can give to that person's body, right? Because we lose that when we lose a person, when we lose a loved one, right? You lose the physicality of that person, of being able to hug them, of being able to speak with them. And so as much as we might talk about soul or spirit or the memories that we have of someone, I think it's important to talk about their body too, you know? Yes?
I usually don't speak, but I used to be an aide at the Lutheran home for 10 years, and I washed dead people's body.
Yeah.
But we were told that 2 aides had to be in with that when somebody would do that.
Oh, yeah.
And so that we can kind of talk to each other and everything would be okay.
Mhm.
After a while, I got used to doing it, so I did that. So.
Yeah, that's not something that you do alone,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And it reminds me of, you said this when we were talking, of Joseph of Arimathea, right? So Jesus has been crucified, he's dead. Usually when people were crucified, their bodies were just kind of thrown away, right? But Joseph of Arimathea goes, gets that precious body, prepares it to be put into the cave, the tomb, and then the women go back with the spices, right? Because that's what you did in those days to prepare a body, is with myrrh and other kinds of oils and spices, because they were going to give that to him, right? He deserved that reverence and that ritual. So what I wanted to talk about now is, if you're interested in this subject, if this is, and it, you're not morbid if you are, but if you are interested in this is like the best book that you can read about it. And it's written by a preacher, so it reads like a sermon in a good way. It's full of stories, it's very accessible, easy to understand, and it's called Accompany Them with Singing: The Christian Funeral by Thomas Long, who is a preaching professor at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. And
He was
it-
here.
yeah, was he? Oh, you lucky people. And it's just really interesting to kind of understand more about the history of where these things came from and why we do them and what the meaning of it is. And this book has helped, for me, shed light on this conversation that we've had. So like when you've been to a funeral and you're like, ooh, that's weird. This book kind of helps to explain maybe why you're feeling that weirdness, or that was really lovely. This sheds light on that as well. So he kind of has this thesis in the book that he proposes right away, and I'd like to read it to you really quickly. In June of 1963, a Christian lay dying in Rome. His baptismal name was Angelo Roncalli, but he was then far better known to the world as the beloved Pope John the 23rd. The son of an Italian sharecropper, this modest man had earned the affection of the common people and had led the church into a season of dramatic reform. And now good Pope John was facing his final hours on earth. When at last it became apparent to all at the bedside that death was at hand, his doctor hesitantly spoke to him, saying, "Holy Father, you have asked me many times to tell you when the end was near so you could prepare." The Pope's sunken and pale face bore the marks of the cancer that would soon take his life, but he smiled nevertheless. "Yes, don't feel badly, doctor," he replied. "I understand. I am ready." Then the Pope's secretary collapsed beside the bed, weeping. The Pope reached out and touched him tenderly, caressing his head. "Courage, my son. I am a bishop, and I must die as a bishop, with simplicity, but with majesty, and you must help me. Go get the people together." So this is his thesis, that a Christian must die as a Christian, with simplicity, but also with majesty. And they need help to do it. And in order to do that, we got to get the people together. So that's the framework of this whole book, and it's really great. I recommend it highly to you. So now what I'd like to do is show you this short video. This is from several years ago. They were digging a parking lot in England, and as they were digging this new parking lot, they came across all of these bones. And through DNA testing and archaeology and a bunch of other stuff, discovered the remains of King Richard III, who died in the last battle of the War of the Roses, I believe. And so they knew which particular bones were his, and reinterred him, because at the end of the battle, there's not really time for a funeral, right? It's a mass grave, quickly dug and quickly covered. So they got his bones and they had a funeral. So this is from his funeral. And what I'd like you to, how many years later? Hundreds and hundreds, right? So what I want you to just look at it visually, but listen to the words, words are used, but also notice the visual of what's happening as well. So these are just some highlights from King Richard III's funeral.
More than 500 years ago, King Richard III was buried by Franciscan friars a few yards from here. His grave hurriedly dug, and a simple funeral without pomp would have been offered. Today we are committing his mortal remains to the consecrated ground of this cathedral. Here in a cathedral, history meets the present. Here, eternity breaks into time.
And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here. My bones, scripted in light upon cold soil, a human brain. My skull, scarred by a crown, emptied of history. Describe my soul as incense, votive, vanishing. Your own the same. Grant me the carving of my name.
The rest is just the song.
So those are highlights from King Richard III's funeral. And I'd like to just hear what you noticed, other than the fact that Benedict Cumberbatch was reading a poem at his funeral. Okay.
His cousin.
This is his cousin. Okay, so what did you notice? I show this to you because, in my opinion, in this is simplicity and majesty, right? So what did you see?
Simple cloth.
Yeah, it's like a pine box, right? Yeah, and on like a wooden stand. So if there was anyone that could get away with having a super ostentatious casket, it's a King of England, right? And he's in a pine box. Yeah, what else did you see?
Reverence and respect.
Yes, reverence, right? I don't know if they were soldiers, but the pallbearers, very nicely dressed, walking slowly, knowing exactly what they're doing, lowering that casket to where it will be interred in the cathedral. What else did you see? Yes, ma'am.
Well, even the music was simple.
Yes.
There were no fanfares and no big trumpets and that might be for, a king's funeral.
Yes, so
Just very simple, high church.
simple
music.
music, not a lot of fanfare or trumpets or anything like that. It was simple and beautiful at the same time, yes.
Very traditional, all men in leadership.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So it was traditional. Anything else? Yeah.
And the words about eternity coming into today, being this part of history.
So why do you think they gave this man a funeral, right? There's no, apparently Benedict Cumberbatch is somehow distantly related to him, 16 times removed. But there's no family who can say that they mourn this man's passing, right? And he's been dead a long time. Like, why have a funeral for him? Yeah, what do you think?
To honor him, and I also noted there was a gentleman there in the picture. He had one medal on his suit coat, which was the St. George's Cross, which is the same as our Medal of Honor. So they were very, very highly respected people there.
Yes, the Countess of Wessex was there as well, like royal people were there. And they were wearing black, right? Like they were in mourning. So any other thoughts on why give this 500-year-old set of bones a funeral?
An acknowledgement of their history.
An acknowledgement. What do you think, Brian?
I was gonna say the same thing, just in theory, we all, whether we're a king or homeless, deserve some kind of acknowledgement and honor of our life.
Yeah, because life is precious, because we are all made in the image of God, because by virtue of the fact that we are daughters and sons of God, we are members of a royal priesthood, right? Even if you're not a king, you deserve the reverence and the care and the love and the notice of people at the end of your life, right? You deserve that. You're a king, even if you're not Richard III. You're a queen, even if you're not Elizabeth. So I recommend this book to you. And
What's the name of it again?
it's called Accompany Them with Singing, because that's what you're supposed to do at the end, right? To sing someone off. Yes.
Within the early Christian practice, and I think within Jewish tradition, as the people accompanied the body, they would sing psalms, which a part of that comes from that tradition as well.
So, do you want to do your history part?
We can skip that for now.
Okay.
We'll do that more next week.
Okay. So what would you like to do now, sir?
Should we go through these nice little sections?
Mm-hmm.
At the bottom.
Okay. So, four things Tom Long says are needed for a good funeral. And again, there's a lot of space for what makes for a good funeral. We've talked about that already. But you need the holy deceased, right? Like you need that person there in some form or another, in his opinion. You need holy people, right? If I'm going to die as a Christian with simplicity and majesty, I need your help. And you need a holy place, okay? But as we all know, those things are difficult in this day and age, right? When you, 2,000 years ago, when an early Christian died, nobody has to take funeral leave to go accompany the body with singing, right? So there are obstacles to having this good funeral that Tom Long talks about. And I'd just like to raise some of those. What makes it hard for the holy deceased to be present at a funeral? Have you been to a funeral where there's no body, no urn, no anything? Yes.
Yes, I have been, and the person donated their body to science.
They donated their body to science. My in-laws, both are planning to donate their bodies to science. And my brother-in-law lately has been very concerned about, like, where are you going to go when they're done with you at, doing what they do on cadavers?
Yeah.
What happens to you then? So
They were going to cremate the remains,
Mhm.
and then those remains would be, I don't know.
It's probably different places, but I guess what I'm saying is if you're going to have a funeral for that person, their body is not necessarily there, right? What other experiences have you had that make this kind of tricky? Darla?
Years ago, when Derry Haggerty's mother died in Ireland, he could not get back for the funeral. So they held a memorial service here for him for closure.
How many of you have been in or heard of or been to a memorial service that perhaps happened months after the person died, right? It's like we can't get all the family together, or we want to bury their ashes at the lake house up north and the ground is frozen, so we're going to get together in the summer when everybody's together and do it then, right? You've all heard of something like that. So perhaps the memorial service, which takes place at some point doesn't have a body there.
Wasn't that Larry Jenbeck's funeral?
Yeah.
Larry,
I
did
think
that
so.
happen with Larry Jenbeck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
What happened? Yes.
When someone dies at war and their body is not recovered.
Yes. Yes.
And being a veteran, there are people with the flag, MIA.
Yes.
We do not forget those people.
Yes. So for all kinds of reasons, in war, in battles, sometimes I think about all the people escaping Syria who died in the Mediterranean Sea. You know, that people's bodies might be lost to us or missing in some way. And that, so you don't get to have the body there for the memorial in that case. What about holy, yes ma'am?
Could you just define a holy deceased? Does that mean the person has to be a Christian? Or what is a holy deceased?
Well, that comes from this book, and it comes forth, but I don't think that he would say that person has to be Christian. I think that he would say, I've written this book about the Christian funeral, so that when I talk about the deceased person, since this book is for Christian people, I'm assuming that the person who has died is a Christian. And so he's calling that person the holy deceased.
Okay, but that, to me, that leaves a whole bunch of people. I have a daughter that doesn't go to church, was raised, you know, all that. And then if she died, she's not a holy deceased?
Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to go through the, what he's pointed out in the book as what he believes are markers of a good Christian funeral.
So hers would not be a Christian funeral, or a bad.
Right. If she's baptized, it could be.
She was baptized and she was confirmed.
That baptism to me would be the marker of holiness first and foremost. You know, so that how much it would feel or she would desire to be Christian. You know, that's between her and God. But my holy here, I think, is God's adjective as opposed to our adjective. Because last I checked, we are some pretty unholy people.
Holy doesn't mean Christian.
Romans 8:1, nothing is intrinsically unholy if we could live in the creation.
So let's just say then that for the people gathered at a funeral, what might be some challenges to having people at the funeral, or gathering the right people, or the people that you want to have there?
Distance. Location.
Distance, location.
Lack of public announcement.
Maybe no public announcement. I had no idea how expensive it was to run an obituary.
And if you want to put a
Some are long.
My grandfather insisted that there would be no obituary for him because he thought it was a waste of money. Distance, location. People used to get to have a few days off of work every year to attend a funeral. You really don't get those anymore. You may get personal days, right? So that has meant that there are fewer and fewer funerals that happen on weekdays. They want them to happen on the weekend so that certain people can get there or fly in or gather, which might separate the actual death from the funeral by a week or more, depending on when people can get there.
And it connects to the body of the deceased as well, because there's certain time limits that the state of Wisconsin sets for how long you can preserve an embalmed body before burial and so on and so forth. So if cremation's the option, that's a lot easier. But getting the people and the body together at the same time, because of some of those weird state statutes and practices and how long the embalming fluid prevents enough decay to make them worried about, all of those things play to that too.
What is not a Christian funeral?
Well, we can talk about that next week because we're going to go through the funeral rite together. So what about holy place, or what about having, what challenges might arise to having a funeral in a church?
Scheduling.
Scheduling? Distance? Oh, membership, or that person doesn't belong to a church or isn't a Christian, actively Christian person. What did you say?
Capacity.
Capacity.
Yeah. In my hometown, a prominent person died, and it happened at my church, even though they were Roman Catholic, because the church I grew up in had enough seats.
Yeah. Enough seating.
Enough places to sit.
Yeah. Or a funeral where the person might have spent a great deal of time and wanted the funeral there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know who I'm thinking of, but.
No.
Well, maybe the church wasn't available. For instance, my daughter was married next door at the Methodist church. St. Matthew's couldn't have they were going through redoing the church.
Oh yeah, the church was under construction. Yeah.
Renovation.
Yes.
Or people whose churches have closed. I mean, the church
Oh yeah, that they grew up in is no longer there. Yeah.
Have you ever had a case where the deceased had requested that somebody not be present?
Or a family of the
haven't.
deceased.
Have you not?
No, there were some that chose not to be there.
Something that I think informs a lot of funeral planning is cost. Like, it costs money to transport a body from the funeral home to the church and back. Costs money to transport that body again from the church to the burial site. If you don't have that money, if somebody hasn't pre-planned and prepaid for every step of their funeral along the way, it might make more sense to do the whole thing at the funeral home, or to have that person cremated, no matter how much that person would have loved to have their funeral at a church, or that you would love for them to be buried from a church. Funerals are expensive in this
Prohibitively
country.
so, oftentimes.
My husband is a pastor, and this week he was called and asked, they have like a fund. I think here it's called the Sunshine Fund. They have a fund that they can use to help people through all kinds of hard times. And a woman called up and said that her brother was homeless, mentally ill and homeless, and on one of those frigid nights was out all night long and froze to death. And she was hoping that he could give some money to the funeral home so that there could be flowers at his funeral. And my husband said, of course, because he was a Christian and he should die with simplicity and majesty. And he deserved to have flowers at his funeral, you know? So, but there was no money for having that come from a church. There was no money for a plot for him to be buried in. So money has a lot to do with it too.
Can I go back 1 second? Yep. Thinking about Sue Erickson, having the holy deceased present sometimes might not be the actual physical body or ashes. I think back to, I think it was, blanking, Ruth Zarzi. We played the video of her reading the Easter Gospel because she turned 100. In my first church, we had a woman who died at 97, and her children had requested that we play an audio recording of her praying the Lord's Prayer in Norwegian before we prayed it in English. And so we had this kind of connection. So, you know, connecting the deceased and the people, there's more than one way, and I think technology makes that all the more open, but there's also caveats and challenges to that too, as far as some people might not be able to handle the emotions of hearing their loved one so soon after they've
Correct.
died. Whereas for others, it's great comfort, that everyone grieves differently. There's a great a character actor who died a few years ago. His name is Jim Rebhorn. He played a lot of FBI agents, and he was Lutheran. And he died unexpectedly, but had written his own obituary. And in it, he wrote, thinking about people in place, all 4 of my children will grieve differently. I hope they find what they need to make sense of my death and my presence among them and to celebrate my life. I thought that was really fascinating. A, he wrote his own obituary, which is kind of cool. But B, he was able to see there would be no funeral, people, place, body, that would meet the needs fully of each of his 4 kids. That parts of it would be helpful to them, parts of it would be not. And so that when we think about these things, is it for us? Is it for the people who are left? Is it for the people who have died? There's no right answer to that, but there's always a mix in how these three parts of it come together that bring comfort. And as we talked about, hymns. If there's amazing, I've been part of funeral planning where Amazing Grace is absolutely going to be in the service, and the other half of the people say, heavens no, anything but. And I'm somewhere in the middle. But it's so fascinating that there is this balance all the time. It feels very Lutheran, a little bit of everything coming together to make sense of that. So thanks for letting me interrupt there.
No, so we've, Tom Long again kind of sets forth this fourfold, what makes for a good funeral, and we can debate about that as much as we want to, but it's the deceased person, their people, their place, and the last one is a script, right? The words that we say. And that's what we'll talk about next week. And we'll get out, the old ELW, and we'll look at the funeral rite and talk about why are these things said. So Holy Script will be kept for next week, along with some really kind of practical resources and time for you to think about what you might want at your own funeral. And I don't say this so that you can control every detail from beyond the grave. My mother-in-law has planned out every detail of her funeral. She knows exactly how she wants it to be. And then we say, but you're going to be gone, so we can do it.
Wouldn't she be the only one to be disappointed?
Yeah. But also, Pastor Matt and Pastor Chris and I have been in a situation where perhaps the children of the person who died are not church people. And then they're put in the position of, what hymns do you think your mom would have wanted at her funeral? And they have no idea, right?
They'll go through a personal Bible, and Dee Burchell, she marks every verse we read in Bible study. They would pick the whole Bible. Because they wouldn't know what, It's amazing what underlined passages we don't know why were underlined become funeral texts.
Is it possible to have a piece of paper?
Yeah, we're going to give you paper and pencil. We're going to have some tables set up in here.
Well, I think we'll be downstairs next week.
Oh, in the fellowship hall, so we can sit at a table, talk about it, and write things down. It's going to be a workshop. It's going to be great. Okay.